Jace was a quiet human who lived alone on the edge of a small colony world. He worked as a mechanic and fixed broken machines that no one else wanted to touch. His workshop was made of scrap metal, old parts, and solar panels that barely worked. Behind his shop was a junkyard filled with broken robots, empty crates, and rusty engine pieces. It wasn't much, but it was his home, one cold night. As Jace was cleaning his tools, he heard a strange noise outside. It sounded like something was moving in the junkyard. He paused, listening closely. A soft clank. Then a quiet shuffle. He frowned, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out into the cold wind. The moonlight was dim, and the junkyard shadows moved with every gust of wind. He walked slowly between the piles, his boots crunching on gravel and bits of glass. Then he saw it, a small shape darting behind a pile of broken crates. Too fast to see clearly. It wasn't a rat. It was too big, and its movement was careful, like it didn't want to be noticed. "Hello," Jace called out gently. No answer. He waited for a moment, then turned back, but in the corner of his eye, he caught a glimmer, two small, glowing eyes, watching him from the shadows. He didn't move, didn't even breathe. The eyes blinked once, then vanished into the darkness. That night, Jace couldn't sleep. Someone or something was out there, and it wasn't just a curious animal. The next morning, he found something strange. A few of his tools were missing, and a storage box had been opened and left half empty. He didn't feel angry, just confused. Why would someone steal food, a few bandages, and a flashlight? The next evening, Jace prepared a small package. He took a blanket from his bed, clean water bottle, some fruit, and a protein bar. He placed them on top of a crate near the junkyard entrance and left a note. "You don't have to steal, you can ask," he wrote. Then he turned off the lights and waited inside. Hours passed. Then, just before dawn, he looked outside. The package was gone. He smiled a little. At least the visitor was real and not his imagination. The next night, he left another gift. This time, he stayed up late, hiding behind the cracked window of his shop, watching. The wind howled, and dust danced in the moonlight. Then he saw her, a small alien girl, thin and shaking, crawled out from behind a metal shell. Her skin was pale blue with soft, dark stripes down her arms and legs. She moved like someone hurt, slow and careful. Her hands trembled as she picked up the blanket and wrapped it tightly around herself. Then she grabbed the food, looked around quickly, and ran back into the shadows. Jace didn't move. He just stared, stunned. She was so small, maybe 7 or 8 years old in human age, and she looked terrified, like she thought the world was going to hurt her again. He wanted to call out, but he didn't want to scare her, so he stayed silent, heart aching. For the next few days, Jace left small things outside for her. Fresh clothes, warm socks, food, even a tiny lantern with a soft yellow light. Sometimes the gifts disappeared within minutes. Sometimes they stayed for hours before being taken. Then, on the 5th night, something changed. Jace heard footsteps outside his door, not sneaky, not running, just small steps. When he opened the door, he found the girl standing near the junkyard fence. She was still wrapped in the blanket he gave her. Her big eyes stared at him, unsure, but not angry or afraid. Not anymore. Jace knelt slowly and smiled. "Hey there," he said softly. "Cold night, huh?" She didn't answer. He didn't expect her to. After a few seconds, she turned and walked away without a sound. But this time, she didn't run that night. Jace sat alone in his workshop, holding a mug of warm tea. He stared at the door, thinking about the girl. Why was she hiding in a junkyard? Where was her family? And why? Was she so scared of humans? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. She was out there, cold and alone, and he was the only one who cared enough to help. He looked at the blanket she had taken, now missing from his shelf. That simple gift had done something. It had started to melt the fear in her eyes, and that was enough for now. Tomorrow, he'd try again, every morning, before the sun fully rose over the dusty colony skies. Jace would step outside with a small hope in his heart. He would check the crate near the junkyard fence, and sure enough, the food was gone again. But not just the food. One time, the socks, too. Another time, the small toy he had left, an old robot cube that blinked and made a tiny chirping sound. The girl never showed herself fully, but she was always there. He could feel it. When he moved through the junkyard, he sometimes heard the softest scrape of metal or caught a flicker of movement, like someone watching him quietly, not with anger, but with fear and something else too, something like curiosity. He started talking out loud when he worked, even if no one answered. "I'm fixing this old drone today. It's got a fried sensor and bad wiring," he'd say while adjusting wires. Or, "I burned the eggs again. Guess I'll eat toast." While eating breakfast, he wasn't crazy. He was talking to her, and though she didn't reply, he noticed something odd when he complained that his solar panel was cracked. The next day, it had been cleaned with a soft cloth. When he dropped a screwdriver and didn't find it, the next morning it was on his workbench. She was helping him in small ways. One night, while Jace pretended to sleep, he heard light footsteps in the workshop. He didn't move, just listened. The girl was inside. He heard the rustle of her blanket, the creak of the floor near the heater. She was warming herself, maybe even looking around. He opened his eyes just a little and saw her crouched near the corner, her arms hugging her knees. She wore the same blanket like a cape, but her eyes were scanning the tools on the wall, not to steal, but to understand. Then suddenly, she froze. Sensing his gaze, their eyes met. She panicked, jumped back, and bolted through the back door before he could even sit up. But that night, she didn't go far. He knew it. He could feel her presence just outside the walls. The next morning, instead of putting out food, he sat quietly by the fence and left a folded piece of paper with a drawing on it. A sketch of himself on one side and her on the other, both sitting by a fire. It was simple. A child could have drawn it. But he hoped she'd understand the message. It's okay to be close. That evening, the paper was gone. But something else was left behind in its place. Shiny purple stone. Smooth and warm. It was her gift. Jace held it tightly, his chest heavy. She was beginning to trust him. He kept trying to talk to her. Day after day. One time he said, "You must be smart, kiddo. You fixed my old lamp without me noticing." The next morning, the lamp was working again. Flickering in the corner with soft yellow light, she never spoke, but her answers were there. In small, quiet actions, he began calling her kiddo more often. He knew it wasn't her real name, but he wanted her to feel known. He also started leaving out things she might like: little warm boots, mittens, even storybooks with pictures. He noticed that one book had its pages turned the next day. She was reading them, slowly, maybe in secret, maybe under that same blanket, curled up in her metal nest under the stars. One cold morning, Jay stepped outside and found something strange. Not a gift, not a missing tool, but a small handprint. On the dusty window near his workbench, he placed his own hand next to it. It was tiny. She had been close. Closer than ever before. That night, he left the back door unlocked on purpose. He didn't say anything, didn't leave food or toys, only kept the lights dim and the heater warm. And then he sat by the table, pretending to work, waiting. After an hour, he heard the softest creak. She had entered. He didn't turn around, just kept working with a smile. She stepped in slowly, quietly, like a ghost, afraid of being seen, but she stayed. This time, she didn't run, she sat in the corner. Same blanket wrapped around her, eyes wide, staring at the heater. Jace gently pushed a small bowl of soup toward her side without looking up. Not too hot, he whispered. She didn't reply, but minutes later, the bowl was empty. When he turned around, she was gone again. But he smiled, because now, the junkyard girl was no longer just hiding. She was watching, learning, listening, and deep inside. She wanted to belong tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, I'll give her something. Even more important than food, a name, a voice, and maybe a reason to stay. The sky turned gray before the sun even rose. A sharp wind blew through the colony streets. Carrying dust and cold air, Jace looked up from his workshop and frowned. A storm was coming, the kind that slammed metal doors and knocked power out. For days, he checked the seals on his windows and tested the backup generator. Better stay inside today, kiddo, he whispered aloud. Even though the room was empty, he didn't know if she was listening. But it made him feel better to say it. By late afternoon, dark clouds rolled overhead. Lightning cracked across the sky, and heavy rain poured down like buckets of ice. The junkyard outside turned into a maze of slippery metal and flooded paths. Jace stared out the window, worried. The girl Luma, as he guessed, hadn't come. Since the previous night, he hadn't seen her take the bread he left or the sweater folded neatly on the crate. Maybe she's found another shelter, he told himself. But his gut said something else. Something was wrong as night fell. The storm grew louder. Wind howled like a monster outside, and thunder shook the walls. Then, just as he was pouring himself a cup of tea, he heard it, a scream, not wind, not thunder, a sharp, terrified child's scream, echoing from the junkyard. Jace dropped the cup. It shattered on the floor. He didn't think. He ran, grabbing a heavy coat, a flashlight, and a medkit. He pushed open the back door. Rain slapped against his face as he stepped into the storm. Water rushed through the junkyard like tiny rivers. He moved fast, searching, calling out, "Kiddo, where are you?" Another scream, this one weaker. To his left, he followed the sound, slipping on wet metal, heart pounding. Then he found her. Luma was trapped under a collapsed pile of scrap. A tall pipe had fallen during the storm, pinning her small frame to the ground. She was soaked, covered in mud and oil, her tiny arms shaking as she tried to push it off. Her glowing eyes widened when she saw him. She tried to snarl, to look strong, but her lip trembled and tears streamed down her face. Jace didn't stop to speak. He threw the medkit aside and shoved the metal pile with all his strength. His arms burned, his legs slipped, but finally the pipe shifted enough for her to crawl out. She tried to run, but her leg gave out. Jace caught her just before she fell face first into the mud. "It's okay," he said softly. "I've got you," she whimpered, not in fear this time, but in pain. He looked at her leg, saw the bleeding gash just above the knee. Not life-threatening, but deep and dirty. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms. She was cold. Lighter than she should be. She didn't fight him. Not this time. She clung to the blanket still wrapped around her, wet and heavy. But it was her only shield. He carried her back through the rain, shielding her from the wind. Every step was slow and careful. She buried her face into his shoulder, shivering, not speaking, but not resisting either. Back inside the workshop, Jace set her down on the soft cot near the heater. He wrapped her in towels, dried her hair gently with an old shirt. She watched him with tired eyes, saying nothing. He opened the medkit, disinfected the wound, and stitched it while whispering calm words. She flinched once, but never cried out. Again, when it was done, he wrapped her leg and pulled the blanket over her shoulders. "You're safe now," he said. "I promise." She stared at him, blinking slowly. Then, in a quiet, shaking voice, she asked, "Why?" "Help me," Jace looked at her, surprised. It was the first time she'd spoken directly to him. He smiled, warm and tired, because no one should be alone in the rain. He replied, especially not someone so small and brave. Her eyes welled up again, but she didn't cry. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around herself and lay back on the cot. He sat nearby, watching her until her breathing slowed. Soon she was asleep, her face finally peaceful. That night, Jace didn't sleep much. He stayed near her, listening to the storm rage outside. But inside, there was only warmth, a quiet. Space filled with soft light and the sound of steady breathing. In the middle of the night, she mumbled something in her alien language. He didn't understand it, but her voice was soft, almost happy. He smiled. The storm outside could keep roaring. But inside this small workshop, something beautiful had started. Trust. And maybe even a bond that would never break. The storm was gone by morning. The air still smelled of wet dust and broken power lines. But inside the workshop, it was calm. The little heater hummed softly, and the lights flickered gently like candlelight. Luma was still asleep on the cot. She was curled up, holding the now-dry blanket close to her chest like a shield. Her small chest rose and fell slowly. Jace sat in the chair beside her, sipping reheated tea and watching the rainwater drip from the roof. He had questions. Where had she come from? Why was she alone? Why did she hide in a junkyard like a scared animal? But this was not the time for questions. This was the time to be quiet, gentle, and patient. He didn't wake her. Instead, he quietly cleaned the floor, sorted tools, and made warm broth on the hot plate. Once the smell of food filled the room, Luma stirred. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the unfamiliar ceiling. Then her gaze moved to Jace, who was sitting nearby, holding a bowl, hungry. He asked softly. She didn't answer, but her eyes stayed on the bowl. He placed it on the table beside her and stepped back. She reached for it with trembling hands and began to eat, slowly and carefully. Each sip was followed by a long pause. Like she didn't believe the warmth was real, Jace said nothing. He didn't want to scare her, but his heart ached watching her eat like someone who hadn't had a real meal in weeks. He wondered how long she'd been hiding, surviving off scraps. And fear, after finishing, she looked at him for a moment. Then she said one word, quiet and unsure. Thank you. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear. Jace smiled. You're welcome, kiddo. She blinked, confused. Kiddo. He chuckled softly. It's a name I gave you. She looked down at the blanket and whispered, Luma. He froze. Then repeated gently, Luma. That's your name? She nodded slowly, like saying it aloud made it more real. He smiled wider. Luma it is. The name suited her. Soft and full of light, even if she didn't see it in herself yet, he did. Over. The next few days, the workshop became her shelter. She didn't talk much, but she stopped flinching when he moved. She sat closer to the heater, sometimes beside him when he worked. She even laughed once softly when one of his repair drones made a funny noise and fell over. She still didn't go outside. She stayed close to the shadows, the walls, the blanket, but she was there. And Jace made sure she felt safe. He built a small shelf just for her, lined it with books, small toys, and a nightlight shaped like a star. When she saw it, she didn't speak, but that night, he found her curled up near the shelf, sleeping peacefully. The starlight glowed beside her, casting soft light over her face. Jace also taught her new words. He would point to objects and say their names. She would repeat them slowly, with effort. But her voice grew stronger each day. Spoon, he said, handing it to her, SP. Oon, she repeated, then smiled proudly. He clapped softly. She giggled behind her fingers. That giggle stayed with him all night. One evening, she helped him fix a small cleaning bot. Her tiny fingers were careful and her eyes sharp. She watched how he moved the wires and copied him perfectly. You're a fast learner, he said. She looked up and whispered, I watch you, always. That made Jace pause. He realized then she hadn't just been surviving, she had been observing him for weeks. How he moved, how he spoke, how he treated things, and she had chosen to trust him. That meant more than any thank you, but just as things began to feel calm, something strange happened. A message arrived on Jace's comm unit. A security drone had detected unauthorized movement in the junkyard the night before. Jace hadn't seen anyone, but the system flagged it. He didn't tell Luma, but he noticed the change in her eyes. She looked more alert, more careful, like she had seen something or someone while he slept. That night, she moved her cot closer to his workbench. She didn't say why, but she didn't sleep well. Jace sat nearby, pretending to read a book, but his eyes stayed on the door, and his hand rested near the old plasma pistol under his tool table. He didn't know what was coming, but he had made a promise to Luma. He would protect her, no matter what. The morning light broke through the cracked window. Soft rays painted golden lines across the workshop floor. But something in the air felt different. Jace felt it the moment he opened his eyes. Luma was already awake, sitting by the heater. Her legs pulled to her chest. She didn't look at him like she usually did. She just stared at the wall, her eyes distant. She was hiding something. He could feel it in the silence. Bad dream. Jace asked gently, stretching his arms. Luma didn't answer. She blinked once, then nodded slightly. He didn't push her. She had come so far in a few short days. But whatever was troubling her wasn't just in her dreams. It was real, and it was close. Later that day, Jace went out to gather parts from the junkyard. The storm had scattered metal all over the place, and he needed materials for a repair job. He made sure to keep an eye on the security cams this time. He didn't want any surprises. As he moved between piles, he noticed something odd. Footprints, not his, not Luma's, too large, too deep. They came from the far end of the yard, the one near the old gate. Someone had been here recently, maybe last night. Jace knelt down and checked the tracks he had trained in the militia before becoming a mechanic. He still remembered how to read signs. Whoever it was, they weren't looking for scrap. They were searching, moving with purpose. Jace felt a cold chill run through him. He stood up quickly and went back inside. Luma was sitting in her usual spot, pretending to read one of the picture books, but her hands were shaking, just slightly. He watched her for a moment, then asked calmly, "Luma, is someone looking for you?" Her eyes froze. The book slid from her fingers and hit the floor. She didn't speak. She just sat there, her little shoulders trembling. Jace walked over slowly and knelt beside her. "You're safe here, I promise," he said softly. "But I need to know if there's danger coming." Still, she didn't say anything. But her fingers slowly reached into her blanket and pulled something out. A small metal tag, half bent and covered in dirt. Jace took it and turned it over. His stomach dropped. It had a symbol on a 10X-shaped mark with 2 rings. He recognized it instantly. The Collectors, a black market group known for trafficking alien children. People thought they were just a myth, a ghost story to scare travelers. But this tag was real. And so was the fear in Luma's eyes. Jace looked at her and whispered, "Did they hurt you?" Luma nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "They cage small ones. Make pets," she whispered in broken English. Jace's hands clenched. So that's why she was hiding like a wild animal. She had escaped something horrible. "You escaped them?" he asked. She nodded again. "Run far, hide long," she said. Softly, her voice cracked. "Others. Not lucky." Jace took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Did they follow you here?" Luma nodded again. Her lips trembled, and she whispered, "They come soon." That was all he needed to hear. Jace stood up and went to the back of the workshop. He opened a hidden panel behind the wall. Inside was a locked case covered in dust. He opened it, revealing a plasma cutter, a shock baton, and an old body shield. He hadn't used these in years, but for her, he would again. He turned to Luma, who watched with wide eyes. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said firmly. "No one's taking you again." Luma stood slowly and walked toward him. She reached into her blanket one more time and pulled out a small piece of torn cloth. It was dark green with a number written on it. "This? From friend," she said. "He helped me run." Jace took it and placed it in his pocket. He looked around the workshop. It was no fortress, but he could reinforce it. He could set traps, reroute the power grid, prepare escape tunnels. If they came, they would regret it. That night, Jace didn't sleep. He worked until morning, welding doors, resetting cameras, and placing sensors. Luma sat nearby. Watching him silently, she didn't cry anymore. She was scared, yes, but not alone. Before sunrise, she spoke again. "Why you do this? For me?" she asked quietly. Jace didn't stop working. He smiled softly and said, "Because the day I gave you that blanket, you became my responsibility." He paused, and maybe even more than that. Luma blinked slowly. She didn't understand everything he said, but she understood enough, and for the first time, she smiled. The next morning, the sky was too quiet. No wind, no sound. Just a strange stillness that made Jace uneasy. The sensors at the junkyard's edge flickered, sending small alerts to his wrist panel. Movement had been detected again, but this time, something was different. The alert signal was cut off halfway, as if someone had disabled the sensor before it could finish sending its message. Jace's jaw tightened. They were here. He turned to Luma, who sat near the shelf of books with her blanket pulled around her shoulders. Her eyes met his, and he could tell she already knew. Her hands trembled, but she didn't cry. She just said, "They find me." Jace grabbed his old plasma cutter and the shield unit from under the workbench. His voice was steady, but firm. "You stay inside, no matter what." She didn't argue, just nodded once, eyes wide with fear, but also trust. He stepped outside, boots crunching on the dusty path behind the fence. Two figures appeared, tall, armored, and wearing cloaks with the same mark from Luma's metal tag. Collectors, they didn't speak at first. One simply raised a scanner toward the workshop. Jay stepped in front of them. "She's not here," he said flatly. The man didn't reply, just stared at him through his helmet. Then a voice came from behind. "Move aside, human, she belongs to us." Jace turned and saw a third collector, this one shorter, with cold, dark eyes and a scar running down his face. "She belongs to no one," Jace replied. "Not anymore." The collector smirked. "You don't understand what she is. Do you?" Jace kept his weapon low. "Ready? She's a child," he said. "That's all I need to know." The collector shook his head. "She's not just a child," he said slowly. "She's an escaped prototype, a rare crossbreed, engineered to obey. She was meant to serve, to follow commands, and to never speak." Jace felt sick just hearing it. "You made her that way." The man laughed. "We bought her that way, and you're going to give her back, or we'll take her by force." That was enough. Jace raised the plasma cutter and fired. The shot hit the ground near their feet, throwing sparks. "Try it," he said, voice sharp, "and you'll regret it." The two guards charged first. Jace activated the shield. Blocking the first stun shot, he ducked, rolled, and slammed the plasma cutter into one man's chest, short-circuiting his armor. The other tried to stab him with a shock stick, but Jace twisted his arm and sent him crashing into the wall. Only the scarred leader remained. Now holding a compact blaster, he aimed at Jace's chest. "Last warning." He growled, but before he could fire, a small figure slammed into his legs from behind Luma. She had come out despite his orders. She held onto the man's leg, biting his arm with sharp teeth. He screamed and tried to shake her off. Jace tackled him, knocking the blaster away. They wrestled in the dirt, but Jace pinned him at last. "You don't touch her ever again," he snarled. Luma stood beside him, panting. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't hide. She stood tall. The other two men moaned on the ground. Stunned and broken, Jace took the blaster, disarmed it, and tossed it far into the waste. He turned to Luma. "Are you okay?" She nodded, then stepped forward and did something that surprised him. She took his hand, held it tight, and said clearly, "I'm not a pet." Jace's throat tightened. "No," he said. "You're not." They didn't wait for the collectors to wake up. They loaded a small cart with supplies and set fire to the tracking beacon under Luma's blanket. She didn't flinch when it burned. She just watched it turn to ash. Jace took her deeper into the wastelands, to an old outpost he used to work at before he became a mechanic. It was half buried in sand, but still functional. No one would find them there, not easily, over the next few days. Jace worked to improve the security. He set up alarms, reinforced the doors, and hid Luma's presence from every signal. She helped too, fixing wires, rerouting power, learning quickly. She smiled more now, even laughed one night, while they sat under the stars near a small campfire. She looked at him and said, "You came." Jace looked at her, confused. "When?" "When I screamed," she said softly. "You came for me." He nodded slowly. "Always," he said. "Always will." She leaned against his shoulder and whispered, "You're my hero." Jace looked up at the stars and held back tears. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the danger, not the past. Only the fire, the stars, and the little alien girl who was no longer scared of him. The outpost in the wastelands had become more than just a hiding place. It had become a home. Jace and Luma worked side by side every day, repairing old machines, growing food in recycled pods, and watching the skies through the broken roof. The desert was quiet, but it was peaceful, and most importantly, it was safe. Luma had changed. She still wore her blanket, but now it was tied like a cape. She walked with confidence. No longer afraid of shadows or silence, her eyes still glowed. Softly, but now they held life, not fear. She talked more too about stars, about old dreams, and sometimes, even about the cage she had once lived in. Jace listened every time, never interrupting. He never asked her to speak, but she always knew he would listen when she was ready. One afternoon, they sat under the outpost's broken solar array. Fixing panels together, Jace was holding a wrench when Luma said, suddenly, "Do you miss your real family?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, blinking, then slowly sat back. "Yeah," he said finally, "I do. My mom and dad passed away a long time ago, and I never had kids of my own." Luma nodded, looking thoughtful. She picked up a panel and began adjusting the bolts. "I don't remember mine," she said. "Maybe I had them. Maybe not." She shrugged, but her voice was soft. "I only remember cages." And cold floors. Jace's heart twisted. He wanted to erase those memories, but he knew he couldn't. All he could do was help her make new ones. Warmer ones, better ones. That evening, Luma helped him cook dinner. Simple soup and toasted grain bread. She stirred the pot carefully, humming a tune she had made up herself. Jace watched her from the side, smiling without saying a word when the meal was ready. They sat at the old metal table together. The wind howled softly outside. But inside, the little outpost felt warm and full after they ate. Luma disappeared into the back room and returned with something behind her back. She walked up to Jace and shyly held out a small item. It was a hand-carved figure, made from scrap wood, roughly shaped, but clear it was him, with a little round head, scruffy beard, and a long coat made from metal foil. Jace chuckled, holding it carefully. "This is me?" he asked, grinning. She nodded, then pulled out another figure smaller. wrapped in a tiny cloth blanket. "This one's me," she said. "They're friends." Jace's throat tightened again. He set the little figures on the table between them, side by side. "Yeah," he whispered. "They are," later that night. As he was sealing the doors and checking the power levels, Luma stood at the doorway to her room. She was holding her star-shaped nightlight, glowing gently in the dim hallway. "Jace," she called softly. He turned. "Yeah, kiddo." She walked up slowly and looked up at him. "Can I ask something?" "Of course," he said, kneeling down to her level. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "If someone asks me where I live, what do I say?" Jace blinked. "Well," he said, thinking, "you live here, with me." At the old outpost, she looked down. Then back up. "No, I mean, who do I say you are?" Silence filled the space between them for a moment. Jace felt something shift inside him, something deep and emotional. He looked at her face so full of hope and fear, as if one wrong word might break her. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," he said softly. There was a long pause. Then she whispered the word, almost too soft to hear. "Family." Jace froze. Then slowly he smiled. "Yeah," he whispered, voice tight with emotion. "I'd like that." She smiled back and stepped forward, wrapping her small arms around him. It was the first time she had ever hugged him on her own, and it meant more than 1,000 words. From that day on, things changed. She began calling him Jace less often instead. She said "my family" when others on the coms asked who she was with. She never used words like father or uncle. But it didn't matter, they both knew what she meant. One evening, they stood outside, watching the twin moons rise. Jace looked at her and asked, "Do you still have nightmares?" She nodded slowly. "Sometimes, but I have better dreams now too." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Me too," he said. "Me too." As the night grew colder, Luma pulled the old blanket tighter around herself. She still kept it. Even after all this time, it was torn at the edges and faded from the sun. But to her, it was more than just cloth. It was the first thing anyone had given her, the first sign that someone cared, the beginning of her new life. And now, under the starlit sky, with her family beside her, she was no longer scared. Not of the dark, not of the past, and not of what came next. She had her blanket. She had her home. And most of all, she had him.